a lonely cowboy, haunted by a silence deeper than the prairie, bought a girl deemed deaf and broken, sold by her own kin in the heartless dust of a frontier town, only to discover the true nature of her silence was a shield, and the sounds she truly yearned to hear were those of a heart slowly mending beside his own. The sun, a molten coin in a merciless sky, beat down upon the raw, splintered timbers of the makeshift auction block. It wasn't cattle being sold, nor land, nor even tools of questionable worth. It was a girl, Ilara, barely a woman, standing with her head bowed, a rope loosely binding her wrists more for show than actual restraint. Her dress, a faded calico, was torn at the shoulder, revealing a pale crescent of skin that flinched as if from a remembered blow. Dust caked her bare feet and settled in the fine, tangled strands of her hair, the color of autumn leaves after the first frost. Her stepmother, Agnes, a woman whose face was a roadmap of bitterness and cheap whiskey, stood beside the auctioneer, her voice, shrill and grating, extolling the girl's supposed virtues, strong enough for field work, quiet as a mouse, and best of all, deaf as a post, so she wouldn't be troubled by a man's temper or demands. A cruel cackle followed this pronouncement, echoing off the indifferent faces of the small crowd of men, a mix of hard-bitten ranchers, desperate drifters, and leering opportunists. Ilara did not look up. She kept her gaze fixed on the dusty ground, on a small, tenacious weed pushing its way through a crack in the earth. That weed was her focus, a tiny emblem of survival in a world determined to crush her. She heard every word, every jeer, every speculative murmur, but her face remained a carefully constructed mask of oblivion. Years of Agnes's rages, of flying fists and scalding words, had taught her that silence and stillness were her only allies, her feigned deafness a sanctuary no one could breach. Elias Thorne watched from the shade of the general store's overhang, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his worn Stetson. He was a man carved from the harsh landscape itself, lean and weathered, with eyes the color of a winter sky, eyes that had seen too much and said too little. He'd come to town for supplies, not for spectacle, least of all one as vile as this. The raw grief that had been his constant companion for 5 years, a hollow ache where his wife and child used to be, twisted into something sharper, something akin to disgust. He knew the girl wasn't deaf. He'd seen her flinch, a minute tightening around her eyes, when a blacksmith's hammer had rung out unexpectedly from down the street, a sound Agnes, in her drunken spiel, hadn't noticed. But it wasn't his business. He had learned long ago that interfering in the ugliness of others only brought more pain. Yet, as Agnes named a pitifully low price, her greed warring with her haste to be rid of her burden, something in Ilara's slumped posture, in the almost imperceptible tremor of her hands, snagged at a chord deep within him, a chord he thought had long since frayed beyond feeling. He thought of Sarah, his Sarah, and the way her small hand had felt in his. This girl was not Sarah, but she was someone's daughter, someone's life, being sold like a sack of grain. Before he could reason himself out of it, before the familiar numbness could reclaim him, Elias stepped forward. His voice, when it came, was rough from disuse, low and steady. "I'll take her." A hush fell. Agnes's eyes, small and glinting, fixed on him. The auctioneer, a paunchy man with sweat stains under his arms, looked surprised. Elias named a price, double what Agnes had asked, not out of generosity, but to end the haggling, to curtail the humiliation. Coins clinked. A grimy hand snatched them up. A bill of sale, crude and barely legible, was thrust at him. He ignored it. He walked towards Ilara, his shadow falling over her. She did not look up, not even when he reached out and, with surprising gentleness for a man whose hands were calloused and scarred, untied the rope from her wrists. He simply nodded towards his wagon, laden with sacks of flour and beans. "Come," he said, his voice pitched for her to hear, a subtle test. He saw no flicker of recognition, only a slow, hesitant obedience as she rose, her movement stiff and uncertain. He didn't press. The lie was hers to keep, for now. He helped her onto the wagon seat, his touch impersonal, brief. The town watched, whispering, as the lonely rancher from out past Whisper Canyon drove away with the girl no one else wanted, the girl sold as deaf, the girl who carried her silence like a shroud. The journey to his remote homestead was long, measured by the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the vast, empty expanse of the prairie stretching out on all sides. Ilara sat ramrod straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon, never on him. Elias didn't speak. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound hollow, or worse, demanding. He offered her a canteen of water once. She took it, drank sparingly, and handed it back, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting instant, cool and trembling. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, colors as turbulent and beautiful as the unspoken emotions that filled the space between them. When they finally reached his cabin, nestled in a small, sheltered valley, darkness had long since fallen, the stars like scattered diamonds on black velvet. It was a small, sturdy structure of rough-hewn logs, a thin curl of smoke already rising from the stone chimney he'd banked the fire before leaving. A place of solitude. A place of deep, abiding silence. The cabin was stark, furnished with a rugged table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and a narrow cot in one corner. In the other, a larger, rougher bed where Elias slept. He gestured towards the cot. "Yours," he said, his voice low. Elara gave no sign of hearing, but after a moment's hesitation, she moved towards it, her eyes scanning the small space with a wary intensity. He built up the fire, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls. He prepared a simple meal, bacon, beans, and coffee, the familiar domestic sounds echoing strangely in the presence of this silent girl. He set a plate before her on the table. She ate slowly, methodically, her gaze mostly downcast. He ate standing by the hearth, watching the flames, acutely aware of her every small movement, the faint rustle of her worn dress, the soft click of her fork against the tin plate. The silence in the cabin was different from the silence of the prairie. Here, it was contained, concentrated, thick with unspoken questions and unhealed wounds. He wondered what terrors had driven her to such a profound deception, what cruelties she had endured to make feigned deafness her only refuge. He found a clean, worn shirt of his and a spare blanket, placing them on the foot of her cot. He expected no thanks, and received none. He turned his back, giving her privacy, and unrolled his bedroll on his own bed. Sleep did not come easily. He lay listening to the sounds of the night, the wind sighing through the pines outside, the distant yip of a coyote, the soft, almost inaudible breaths of the girl on the cot. He was a man accustomed to solitude, who had courted it after loss had scoured him raw, but this silence, shared with another living, breathing soul, was a different beast entirely. It was a silence that held the faint, fragile promise of something other than emptiness. Days bled into weeks. A quiet rhythm established itself. Elias would rise before dawn, tend to his few cattle, mend fences, chop wood. Elara would be up when he returned for breakfast, the fire already lit, coffee brewing. She'd learned his routine by observation. She never spoke, never made a sound that wasn't strictly necessary. She moved like a phantom through the small cabin, her presence both constant and elusive. He continued to speak to her as if she could hear, simple, direct statements about chores, or the weather. "Rain's coming," he'd say, looking at the bruised clouds massing on the western horizon. Or, "Need more wood for the stove." She would watch his lips, his face, sometimes with an unnerving intensity, then nod slowly, or simply proceed with the task he'd indicated if it was within her understanding through context. He never tried to trick her, never shouted from behind her to see if she'd turn. Her secret, if it was one, was safe with him, though he remained certain. He found her mending one of his shirts one afternoon, her stitches neat and precise, far better than his clumsy attempts. He'd left it, torn by a rogue branch, on his bed. He said nothing, but the next day, he left a small basket of his late wife's sewing notions on the table. Bright threads, sharp needles, a silver thimble. When he returned that evening, the basket was on the windowsill, and a patch on his denim trousers, previously threadbare at the knee, was now expertly reinforced. Small, unspoken exchanges became their language. He'd leave a wildflower on her plate, a splash of prairie blue amidst the drabness. She'd ensure the kindling box was always full. He noticed she favored the sunlit patch by the window, and he cleared the overgrown vines that obscured it. She, in turn, started tending the small, neglected herb garden his wife, Mary, had planted years ago, her gentle hands coaxing green shoots from the stubborn earth. It was a quiet dance of mutual provision, of unspoken acknowledgements. Ilara watched Elias with an intensity that missed nothing. She saw the way his hands, though rough and calloused, were gentle with the animals. She saw the deep lines of sorrow etched around his eyes, more pronounced when he thought himself unobserved, staring into the fire late at night. She heard the weariness in his footsteps at the end of a long day, the quiet sigh he'd release when he finally sat down. She knew he suspected her hearing, his deliberate way of speaking, facing her, the occasional, searching look in his eyes. But he never challenged her, never tried to expose her. This forbearance was a balm to her wounded spirit, a stark contrast to Agnes's constant, invasive cruelty. The pretense of deafness was a heavy cloak, woven from years of fear, but in Elias's quiet presence, it began to feel suffocating. Yet, she clung to it, the only shield she knew. She often found herself studying his few belongings. A shelf above his bed held a small, carved wooden bird, its paint faded, its form simple but tender. Beside it, a leather-bound Bible, its pages worn thin. There were no pictures, no mementos of a family, yet the cabin itself seemed to hum with a quiet sorrow, a lingering absence. She knew loss. She had lost her mother young, then her father to drink, then her freedom to Agnes. But Elias's sorrow felt different, deeper, a wound that had shaped the very core of him. She yearned to offer comfort, but how could she, the silent, deaf girl? Her hands, busy with mending or kneading dough, often stilled as she listened to the wind, a mournful song that seemed to echo the ache in her own heart, and, she suspected, in his. She would sweep the dirt floor with fierce concentration, as if trying to sweep away the shadows that clung to them both. The smell of baking bread, a scent of home she'd almost forgotten, filled the cabin some days, a small offering of warmth she could give. He would eat it with a quiet nod, sometimes a faint softening around his mouth that might have been a smile. These were the moments she hoarded, tiny embers of hope in the long, dark night of her fear. One blustery afternoon, with the wind howling like a banshee around the eaves of the cabin, Elias was late returning. The sky had turned a malevolent grey, spitting sleet that stung like needles. Ilara found herself pacing, a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. She kept glancing out the small, grimy window, straining her ears against the wind's roar for the sound of his horse. She, who had trained herself to ignore sound, now desperately sought it. When he finally stumbled through the door, covered in mud, his face pale and drawn, she saw the dark stain spreading across his trouser leg, high on the thigh. He leaned heavily against the doorframe, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Fence wire," he managed, his voice strained. Horse spooked, damn leg. He tried to take a step and faltered, a sharp hiss of pain escaping him. Ilara was at his side in an instant, her feigned deafness forgotten in the urgency of the moment. She guided him to a chair, her touch surprisingly strong. He looked at her, his eyes clouded with pain, but also with a flicker of surprise at her swift, understanding response. "Need to clean it," he muttered, gesturing towards the wound. She needed no further instruction. She moved with a quiet efficiency that belied her youth, fetching water, tearing strips from a clean linen sheet she'd found packed away in an old trunk. Her hands were gentle as she cut away the blood-soaked fabric, revealing an ugly, deep gash. The sight of it made her stomach clench, but she pushed down her fear. She had seen worse, tended worse, in the brutal household she'd escaped. As she cleaned the wound, her fingers working deftly, Elias watched her face, his expression unreadable. The silence in the cabin was profound, broken only by his harsh breathing and the relentless shriek of the wind. He had lost a lot of blood. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that he needed more help than she could provide. But the nearest neighbor was miles away, and the storm showed no signs of abating. She found a small, locked wooden chest tucked beneath his bed, a chest she had often wondered about. It was old, the wood dark and smooth with age. Now, driven by a desperate instinct, she pulled it out. "Elias," she said, her voice barely a whisper, rusty from disuse, startling them both. "Is there anything in here for wounds?" His eyes widened, not just at her voice, but at the specific question, the implication that she knew, or hoped, it held something more than just keepsakes. He stared at her for a long moment, a complex array of emotions flitting across his face: shock, confusion, and something else, something deeper. Then, a tremor went through him. "Key," he rasped, his gaze flicking to the small wooden bird on the shelf. Inside the bird, Elara's hands trembled as she reached for the bird. A tiny, almost invisible seam ran along its base. She pried it open. A small, tarnished brass key lay nestled within. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she inserted it into the lock of the chest. It turned with a reluctant click. Lifting the lid, she saw not medical supplies, but a collection of carefully preserved items: a baby's tiny knitted bootie, a lock of golden hair tied with a faded blue ribbon, a woman's delicate lace collar, and a small, framed daguerreotype of a smiling woman with kind eyes, holding a swaddled infant. A wave of understanding, so profound it was almost painful, washed over Elara. This was his silence. This was the source of the deep, abiding sorrow she had sensed in him from the very beginning. Tears pricked her eyes, for his loss, for the life that had been stolen from him. He watched her, his face etched with a vulnerability she had never seen. "Mary," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. And little Tom, it was a confession, raw and heartbreaking, offered into the storm-lashed intimacy of the small cabin. Elara carefully closed the chest, the weight of his grief settling upon her. She looked at him, her own pretense of deafness now a flimsy, irrelevant thing. "I'm sorry, Elias," she said softly, her voice clearer now, imbued with a deep, heartfelt sympathy. "So sorry," he simply nodded, his gaze distant, lost in a past that was suddenly, achingly present. The pain of his wound seemed, for a moment, secondary to the pain of memory unleashed. But the practical need reasserted itself. Beneath the treasured mementos, Elara found a small tin of potent herbal salve, Mary's salve, he would later tell her, good for anything from a cut to a burn. She applied it gently to the cleaned gash, then bound his leg tightly with the linen strips. The storm raged on outside, but within the cabin, a different kind of tempest had broken, clearing the air, leaving behind a raw, fragile honesty. He was weak, feverish by nightfall, but he would live. And she, Elara, was no longer just the deaf girl. She was the woman who had heard his deepest sorrow, and spoken words of comfort. The shield was down. The days that followed were a period of slow healing, for Elias's leg and for the fractured silence between them. He was confined to his bed for nearly a week, and Elara tended to him with a quiet devotion. She cooked for him, kept the fire burning, changed his dressings, her touch gentle but firm. She spoke little, still hesitant after years of enforced muteness and then feigned deafness, but her voice, when she used it, was soft and melodic. Elias, too, was reserved, but the wall of his stoicism had been breached. He would watch her as she moved about the cabin, a new awareness in his eyes. He knew now that she had heard every word he'd ever spoken to her, understood every nuance of his moods, every unspoken sorrow. The deception, born of fear, was now out in the open, yet instead of anger, he felt a strange sense of relief, and a burgeoning respect for the strength it must have taken for her to maintain such a difficult charade for so long. He asked her once, his voice quiet, "Why, Elara? Why pretend?" She was sitting by the window, mending, the late afternoon sun haloing her hair. She paused, her needle still. "Agnes," she said, her voice barely audible. "If she knew I heard, the beatings were worse." The words, they cut deeper if she thought I understood them. She looked at him then, her eyes wide and earnest. "It was safer to be deaf." Safer to be nothing. Elias felt a muscle tighten in his jaw. He understood. He understood the desperate need for a sanctuary, any sanctuary, from cruelty. He had built his own walls of silence after Mary and Tom were taken by the fever, walls he was only now beginning to realize had also imprisoned him. Their conversations remained sparse, but carried more weight. He told her about Mary, her laughter like wind chimes, her skill with herbs. He spoke of Tom, a bright, curious boy who had loved the wooden bird Elias had carved for him. Elara listened, her heart aching for his loss, but also for the love that so clearly still lived within him. She, in turn, shared fragments of her own past, the bleakness of her life with Agnes after her father died, the constant hunger, the casual brutality, She spoke of her real mother, a distant, warm memory of gentle hands and lullabies. As Elias regained his strength, a new dynamic settled between them. The silence was still there, but it was a comfortable silence now, punctuated by shared tasks and quiet companionship. He taught her how to set snares, how to read the weather in the clouds. She showed him which wild berries were safe to eat, how to make a poultice from yarrow for bruises. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he picked up the whittling knife he hadn't touched in years and a piece of scrap wood. Slowly, hesitantly, he began to carve. Ilara watched, fascinated, as a small, rough shape of a flower began to emerge under his skilled fingers. It was a simple thing, but it felt like a new beginning. But the piece they were slowly building was fragile as the first spring blossoms on the prairie. One crisp morning, as Elias was checking his trap lines and Ilara was hanging laundry on a rope strung between two pines, a figure on horseback appeared on the ridge overlooking the valley. Ilara's blood ran cold. Even from this distance, she recognized the slumped, careless way the rider sat the horse. Agnes. Her stepmother's tenacity, fueled by greed and malice, was something Ilara knew all too well. Fear, sharp and sickening, clawed at her throat. She dropped the wet shirt she was holding and ran towards the cabin, her heart pounding. "Elias," she cried out, her voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. He was already heading back, alerted by the sight of the rider. He reached her side, his face grim. "Stay in the cabin, Ilara. Lock the door." "No," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "She's here for me. Or for more money. I won't hide." Years of passivity fell away from her like a shed skin. She had found her voice, found a measure of safety with Elias, and she would not easily surrender it. Agnes rode down into the valley, her horse kicking up dust. She reined in before the cabin, her eyes, bloodshot and mean, fixing on Ilara, then flicking dismissively to Elias. Well, Agnes sneered, her voice like gravel. "Looky here." The deaf-mute finally found her tongue. "Did she? Or did you cure her, cowboy?" She spat on the ground. "I heard you got hurt. Figured you might be needin' someone to look after you proper. And I figured that girl owes me. Sold her too cheap." Her gaze was avaricious. "I reckon you owe me another $20 for her. Or I take her back. She ain't worth much, but she can scrub floors." Elias stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Ilara. His stance was deceptively relaxed, but Ilara could see the coiled tension in his shoulders, the dangerous glint in his usually quiet eyes. "She's not for sale, Agnes," he said, his voice low and steady, but with an edge of steel. "And you're not welcome here. Ride out." Agnes's face contorted with fury. "Not welcome? This little baggage ran off from me. She owes me." She made to dismount, a malevolent glint in her eye. "I'll drag her back myself if I have to." "You'll do no such thing," Elias stated, his voice dropping to a near growl. He took another step, and for the first time, Agnes seemed to register the quiet deadliness in him. He was no longer just the grieving recluse, he was a man protecting his own. But Agnes was not easily deterred by one man. From behind the ridge, two more riders appeared, rough-looking men Ilara recognized as cronies of Agnes's from the saloon in town. They smirked, their eyes lingering on Ilara with predatory interest. The odds had just shifted. Elias's hand moved almost imperceptibly towards the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. He had hoped to avoid violence, but he would not back down. Ilara felt a surge of terror, but also a fierce, protective anger. These people would not destroy the fragile piece she had found. She would not let them harm Elias. The air crackled with tension. The two thugs dismounted, flanking Agnes, their expressions menacing. "Now, are you gonna be sensible, cowboy?" Agnes smirked, emboldened by her reinforcements. "Or do my friends here have to persuade you?" One of the men, a burly fellow with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, took a step forward, flexing his hands. Elias didn't flinch. His gaze remained fixed on Agnes, the architect of this confrontation. "This is your last chance to leave peacefully," Elias said, his voice dangerously soft. "There won't be another." "I ain't leaving without what's mine," Agnes shrieked, her voice cracking. "Get her, boys." The scarred man lunged. Elias moved with a speed that belied his quiet demeanor. His fist connected with the man's jaw in a sickening crack, sending him staggering back, spitting blood and a tooth. The second man drew a rusty knife, its blade glinting dully in the morning sun, and advanced more cautiously. Elara screamed, a raw, primal sound of fear and fury, not for herself this time, but for Elias. As the knifeman lunged, Elias sidestepped, bringing the barrel of his Colt down hard on the man's wrist. The knife clattered to the ground as the man howled in pain, clutching his injured hand. Agnes, seeing her hired muscle so quickly incapacitated, let out a frustrated yell and, in a fit of pique, grabbed a heavy piece of firewood from the stack near the cabin wall. She charged at Elara, her face a mask of insane rage. "You ungrateful whelp! I'll teach you!" Before Elias could intercept, Elara acted. All the years of pent-up fear, of swallowed pain, of silent endurance, coalesced into a single, decisive movement. She snatched up the still damp, heavy shirt she had dropped earlier and, with a desperate cry, flung it hard into Agnes's face. The wet fabric slapped against Agnes's eyes, momentarily blinding and unbalancing her. She stumbled, arms flailing, giving Elias the second he needed. He grabbed Agnes by the arm, his grip like iron, and spun her around, wrenching the firewood from her grasp. "Enough," he roared, his voice thundering through the small valley, a voice Elara had never heard before, full of righteous anger and protective power. "You will not touch her. You will not threaten her. This is her home now. And you will leave it." He propelled Agnes towards her horse, his face a thundercloud. The two thugs, nursing their injuries and thoroughly cowed by Elias's ferocity, scrambled back to their own mounts. Agnes, sputtering threats and curses, was unceremoniously shoved onto her horse. "You'll regret this, Thorn. Both of you," she screamed, her voice laced with impotent fury. "This ain't over." But her threats lacked conviction. She knew she was beaten. Elias watched them ride away, his posture rigid, until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he allow his shoulders to slump slightly. He turned to Elara. She was trembling, her face pale, but her eyes were bright, alive with a mixture of fear, relief, and a fierce, newfound strength. He walked towards her, his expression softening. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice returning to its usual quiet timbre but now laced with a deep concern. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment, a lump in her throat. Then, words tumbled out. I was so scared. For you. I thought." He simply gathered her into his arms, a gesture so unexpected, so comforting, that she sagged against him, tears finally overflowing. He held her gently, his hand stroking her back, until her sobs subsided. "It's over, Elara," he murmured into her hair. "She won't be back. You're safe here." She pulled back slightly, looking up at him, her eyes searching his. "She called it my home," Elara whispered, a sense of wonder in her voice. Elias met her gaze, his own eyes holding a warmth that melted the last vestiges of her fear. "It is," he said simply. If you want it to be, the air between them was charged, not with tension, but with a profound, unspoken understanding. The confrontation had been brutal, terrifying, but it had also been a crucible, forging a bond between them that was stronger than fear, stronger than the past. In defending each other, in standing together against the darkness, they had found something precious and undeniable. He looked down at her, at the resilience shining in her tear-washed eyes, at the quiet strength that had blossomed in the face of adversity. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the silence in his heart, the vast, empty space left by Mary and Tom, was no longer quite so empty. Elara, the girl he had bought out of a moment's reluctant compassion, the girl who had hidden her hearing behind a wall of silence, had somehow, against all odds, begun to fill it with the tentative, hopeful sounds of a new life. The days that followed the confrontation settled into a new kind of peace, deeper and more resonant than before. The shadow of Agnes and her cruelty had been banished, not just from their valley, but from Ilara's spirit. She moved with a newfound confidence, her laughter, when it came, as clear and bright as a prairie stream. She still spoke softly, but there was no hesitation in her voice now, only a quiet certainty. Elias found himself watching her more and more, marveling at the transformation. The haunted, wary girl was gone, replaced by a young woman of quiet grace and surprising resilience. He started carving more often in the evenings, the shavings falling around his boots as he coaxed shapes from wood, a leaping deer, a soaring hawk, and one day, a small, smiling doll with yarn hair the color of autumn leaves. He left it on her pillow. She found it that night and held it to her heart, tears welling in her eyes, tears not of sorrow, but of a quiet, overwhelming joy. Their life together was simple, dictated by the rhythms of the land and the seasons. They worked side by side, mending the cabin roof before the winter snows, tending the small garden Ilara had coaxed into abundance, storing vegetables and salted meat. The silence between them was no longer a barrier, but a shared space of comfortable companionship, often broken by easy conversation, by her soft humming as she worked, or by his low chuckle at some shared observation. He taught her to read from his worn Bible, her finger tracing the words as he sounded them out, a patient teacher finding joy in her quick learning. She, in turn, taught him the names of the wildflowers she gathered, her knowledge of plants surprisingly vast. One cold evening, with the wind whistling outside and a warm fire crackling in the hearth, Ilara was reading aloud, her voice gaining confidence with every page. She stumbled over a word, and Elias gently corrected her. She looked up, and their eyes met. In that shared gaze, there was a depth of understanding, of affection, that went beyond words. He reached across the small space separating them and took her hand. Her fingers curled around his, fitting naturally into his palm. "Ilara," he began, his voice a little hoarse, "what we have here, this life." She waited, her heart beating a little faster. "It's good," he finished, the simple word imbued with a world of meaning. "It's more than good, Elias," she whispered, her eyes shining. "It's home." He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. It was a promise, a declaration, a testament to the healing power of kindness and the enduring strength of the human heart to find love in the most unexpected places. The lonely cowboy was no longer quite so lonely, and the girl once deemed deaf and broken had found her voice, her strength, and her place in the world, beside him, in the quiet sanctuary of their shared life, a life built not on a transaction, but on a love that had blossomed slowly, surely, like a stubborn prairie flower pushing its way towards the sun. The silence of the past had given way to a future filled with the quiet music of hope.